Hello and welcome to the 12th chapter of the course. In this chapter, we will be looking at bubble ICM adjustments for both the big stacks and the shorter stacks. We'll be looking at deeper stack sizes, shorter stack sizes, direct bubble spots a bit further away from the bubble spots, and all that kind of stuff. We will be looking at 4 different hands and then tinkering with the stack sizes as we always do. Now, the main things we need to keep in mind, the main changes are that first, the short stacks need to be jamming tighter because even though, as we said, risk premium in PKO tournaments is lower, so ICM pressure is basically lower, what happens is that when we jam as a short stack, we have significantly lower fold equity because of the bounty aspect. The main adjustment for the bigger stacks is that even though, as we said, risk premium is lower and they have more incentive to get in against the short stacks, they usually have to play a little bit tighter. Why? For the same exact reason. Because the risk premium is lower, the short stacks can actually stack up wider against a jamming range. So short stack jam less because of lower fold equity, but they get to call off against jams wider because of the lower risk premium. Let's look at a few examples. The first hand I want to look at is this King 10 offsuit here. So this is a 1K buy-in. We are on the direct bubble. So as you can see, there are 14 players left and 13 players paid. And the starting bounty is 250. The starting stack is 10K. And currently, the big blind appears to be, hold on, you can see this on the next one. So the big blind is currently 5K. So one starting bounty at this point would be worth maybe 4K chips. So about one big blind, a bit less than one big blind. For example, Under the Gun has 3 starting bounties. So then his bounty would be worth around 3 big blinds, like 2.8 or so. Right, so let's see how tight or wide can we jam with 6.6 big blinds on the hijack. Now, what happens here is that even though we only have 6.6 big blinds, our bounty is worth, so we have about 2 starting bounties, which is worth around 2-ish big blinds. Because we have a bit more than 2 starting bounties, so around 2 big blinds. Therefore, it's a fairly significant portion of our stack, so our fold equity is very, very low. Because of that, we actually have to jam very, very tight here. And let me show you on the simulation. Here we go. And we have King 10 offsuit. And we can see from the hijack, we get to jam 13%. So even though we only have 6 big blinds, you can see how like King Jack off, Ace 8 off, King 10 off as well, Jack 10 suited, Queen 10 suited, pocket fours are just going to be folds. Again, the reason we fold those hands is because we don't have that much fold equity. For example, the small blind can call us pretty wide. The button can call us pretty wide. The big blind, not so much because he's a very short stack as well and will just end up bubbling if he loses. But overall, the calling range behind are reasonably wide. One thing I want to look at is compare this spot, this exact spot, to if it was a non-PSKO tournament. So everything is the same, stack sizes, everything the same, but instead of this being a PSKO bubble, it is a normal tournament bubble, a vanilla bubble. So let me find it. Here we go. And we can see in the vanilla version, we get to jam up to 18%. You can see here that our jamming range just increases by quite a bit. We start adding suited 10x, we start adding suited 9s, Ace 8 off, these offsuit Broadways, force Ace 2 suited. Because in the normal tournament, the big blind, for example, has to call a lot tighter, the small blind tighter, button tighter, and so on. So even though making the money is more important in the non-PSKO, we actually play a wider jamming range because people fold more. And one good way to picture this is to think about the risk premiums. So in the non-PSKO tournament, if we look at the risk premiums here, we can see that the hijack, so us, we have about 19% risk premium against the positions behind. Less against the cutoff, who we cover, because he only has 3 big blinds. But you can see against button, small big blind, we have around 19% risk premium. However, they have no incentive to get in against us either. It's just a bubble GPV or like vanilla tournament spot, not GPV. So they just don't really have a reason to get it in against us. For example, the button against us has a 3% risk premium. The small blind has a 4.2% risk premium. So this just shows that they are disincentivized from getting it in against the hijack because, they don't want to risk losing chips either. As we know in ICM, the chips you gain, or the chips you lose are worth more than the chips you gain. So we just don't want to risk losing these chips. In the PSKO example, though, what happens is that our risk premium as the hijack is lower. You can see now it's 15% instead of 19%. And that is because, as we know, ICM pressure in the PSKOs is much lower because the price pool is split in two. We have the boundary price pool and the regular price pool. And then also because it's a more top-heavy structure. So even though our risk premium is lower in the PSKO example, our opponent's risk premium against us is negative. So the button, for example, now has a minus 5.5% risk premium. Before, he had like 4% positive risk premium, so he had to call against us tighter. Now, it's minus 5.5, which means he has more incentive to call against us because of our bounty. Therefore, he ends up calling a wider range. So he went from like plus 3 point something to minus 5.5. So there's like a 9% difference in his risk premium. Therefore, we simply get to jam significantly tighter. By the way, this video might have a few more cuts than previous ones. And that's because I'm suffering from a bit of a cold. So if I need to start coughing or sneezing, I will just pause and continue from that. Don't want to have any of that in the video. All right. So hijack gets to jam very, very tight, as we said in the PSKO. What about the calling ranges behind? Well, the stacks we cover, like the cutoff, will end up calling slightly tighter in the PSKO than in the vanilla tournament. Why is that? Well, if we look at the risk premium, his risk premium will be higher in the non-PSKO tournament. You can see that in the non-PSKO, his risk premium against us is 13.3, whereas in the PSKO, his risk premium against us is 11. So, again, ICM pressure is lower in the PSKO scenario, but because our jamming range is tighter, and because the overcalling range is going to be wider, the cutoff just has to play fairly tight. For example, in the PSKO spot, after hijack jams and cutoff rejams, we can see that the button gets to call very, very wide with suited connected hands. In the vanilla tournament, after hijack jams and cutoff rejams, the button is just calling a very, very tight kind of range because there's just no incentive for him to go after the bounties. So these two factors combined actually make the covered stack get it in tighter in the PSKO. Another way to picture this PSKO risk premium thing that I mentioned is look at the button strategy. When it forces the button is the covering stack, and the small blind has a fairly large bounty. However, even though he covers and the bounty of the small blind is pretty big, the button plays tighter in the PSKO example because the blinds can call wider against the jam. So in the PSKO, the button gets to fold like 15%, raise a lot of the garbage and top range, and then jam a lot of the middling stuff. In the non-PSKO, however, the button doesn't fold anything. The button can jam almost any two cards profitably and just raises the absolute top and the absolute bottom. A hand like 8-5 off, for example, is not going to be a profitable jam in the PSKO. You can see it's losing like $11, but it is a very profitable jam in the non-PSKO tournament. It's making 54. Why is that? Well, again, it has to do with the calling ranges against the jam. If we look at the risk premiums in the non-PSKO tournament, the small blind and the big blind have about 20% risk premium against the button, whereas in the PSKO, the small and the big blind have about 15-14% against the button. So significantly lower. Therefore, in the PSKO example against the jam, they get to call, as you can see, 11 and then 23% accordingly. Whereas in the non-PSKO, they get to call 3.8 and 15. So the biggest difference comes from the small blind, where in the PSKO, he can call 11%, but in the non-PSKO, only 3.8. The reasoning comes that in the non-PSKO, the small blind busting before the bubble with the stack like this is just going to be very, very hurtful. Whereas in the PSQ example, risk premium in ICM is lower, and also his future EV increases a lot by covering the entire table. The same goes what happens against the min raise. Against the min raise, people can jam fairly wide in the PSQ. You can see small blind gets to jam around 20-ish%, 3-bet and jam in total around 19-20%. And the big blind gets to jam around 20% as well. In the normal tournament, we can see that the small blind is jamming almost nothing, 2.9, and the big blind is jamming 14.7. And also, of course, they are defending less as well. So this is the key in those PSKO bubble spots. We need to remember that even though there are boundaries in play, the short stacks jam tighter, but can stack off wider against jams. So on this spot, one thing we could consider is, first, is there supposed to be any limping? And the answer is no, not really. I tried this. I'll tell you in a little bit about it, but basically, yeah, there's no limping happening at all in ICM. I already mentioned that in the limping chapter, but yeah, there's no limping in ICM at all from anyone. Besides, of course, the small blind occasionally, I mean from the other positions. So another thing is, are the calling ranges behind us as the hijack realistic? And I would think probably not. I would think people will end up calling a bit wider in reality. Like, for example, can we see the button folding like Jack 10 suited, Queen 10 suited? When we jam 6.6 and he covers, I would say probably not. So what I did was I node locked some of the responses behind. So basically give the cutoff a bit of a wider range, the button a bit of a wider range, and the blinds slightly wider too. So this makes us jam even tighter. Again, you can see some of the suited hands are no longer jamming. Pocket fives not jamming. Here you can compare. Not a big change, but still something to keep in mind. The more interesting change I wanted to look at is what if everyone at the table just had 10 big blinds more, except us, the hijack? The reason I want to look at this is because now every stack is pretty low, so us having 6.6 big blinds is actually a kind of significant stack, right? Because you can see there is a 3 big blind stack, there is a 6.8, there is a 9.7, so our stack size isn't that far off. Now, what if everyone had 10 big blinds more except us? So we would be by far the shortest stack. First, again, I want to show you the limping, that there is no limping from like any position. You can see it just doesn't really happen. So what happens to our jamming range? Well, it doesn't really change. If we compare this to this, so it was 13.3, now it is 12.8. So if anything, we actually go slightly tighter because of the other guys having a bigger stack, they can actually afford to call us more. So even though our stack size is now by far the shortest, it just doesn't matter. Our risk premium as a hijack has dropped, yes, but people can just call us wider. For example, the button now is at minus 8.5. The big blind is at minus 5, whereas before, the big blind in the original example was at plus 4. And button at plus 5. So all of the positions behind can now call us way wider because of how short our stack is in comparison to the average stack size. So that is another thing worth looking into and thinking about, that it just doesn't matter too much whether our stack is close to the average or not. When we're super short, we just want to be very, very tight in PSKOs. Okay, now on to the next example. The next is from the same tournament. Let me zoom it in a bit here. So now we're a bit further from the bubble. We are at 16 players left with 13 paid. And we face a 4 big blind jam from the hijack. In this point, is actually the cutoff because the small blind was just sat in. He wasn't dealt, Pascal Hartmann wasn't dealt cards this hand. So it's basically the cutoff jamming. He jumps 4 big blinds, which is 20k chips. and the starting stack was 10K. He has two starting bounties, which is worth maybe around 7K at this point, 8K. So his bounty is worth about 1.8-ish big blinds, maybe around 2 big blinds. A few things we will ask ourselves here is how wide should he jam? And how wide can we actually call here? Look at me, I turn to do a Scott for a second. So, first, this is his jamming range. So it is very tight for a 4 big blind stack, right? We're not even on the direct bubble yet. It is 16 left with 13 paid. So there is still quite a few people that need to bust. But he is folding 73%. So he's folding even ace deuce. He's folding low pocket pairs, a bunch of good suited hands. So because of the very, very minimal fold equity, we can see that he just has to fold very strong hands. You can see that average people's risk premium against the cutoff is just very, very low. Small blinds at minus 0.9, big blind minus 5.8. So after he jams, we have to play very tight from the button as well. Something like this. And the reason behind that is, again, that we will get overcalled very wide. So even though we're up against the 4 big blind jamming range, we have to fold ace 8, ace 5 suited, ace 6 suited, queen jack suited, king 10 suited, force, king jack off, of course. I mean, we're folding king 10 suited, so we're folding king jack off as well. So yeah, just a very, very tight kind of rejamming range. And just to show you against these two jams, small blind is calling very, very wide, suited connected hands. As we saw, he'd rather call like ace 6 suited than ace 4 suited. We mentioned that in the multi-way all-in chapter. And big blind gets to call reasonably wide as well. So yeah, I just think it's worth keeping in mind that source stacks have to be really, really tight in the PSQs. Now, another interesting spot here would be what happens blind versus blind. So if you assume that cutoff folds and battle folds, and it falls to the small blind, with the covering stack with 26.5 big blinds, or 27, and the big blind has 13.3. Do we get any 2 jams? How does it work? And the answer is no, we don't. We still want to have a wide raising range with top and bottom, and just jam a lot of the middling stuff. A hand like 7 deuce off, for example, is not a jam. A hand like 10-3 off and so on is, but very, very, very marginal. So it's not a spot where we can jam any 2. We can jam very wide, of course, but yeah, not any 2. Now, what's interesting is how wide the big blind can stack off here. And against the jam, this kind of range, the big blind can stack off with 28% of hands. So if we remember how close we are to the bubble, so 16 left, 13 paid, this is perhaps a surprisingly wide range. You can see queen 9 suited, king 6 suited, king 8 off, ace deuce off. Very, very wide stack of range. The reason the range is that wide is that the big blind against the small blind has only a 12% risk premium, which is pretty low considering how big the stack size is. So 12% is very low, therefore against this very wide jamming range, we get to stack off a lot. This better illustrates what I said about source stacks being able to stack up very wide against wide jamming ranges. The next spot I want to look at is this pocket 9 spot. Let's look at this first, and we'll look at king queen suited later. So here we are 25 players left with 20 players paid. So we are fairly close to the money bubble, but still we need about 20% of the field to bust. So yes, we are close, but we're not actually there yet. So we raise pocket 9s under the gun. Again, this is a spot where we don't want to have limps, and cutoff calls and the small blind squeezes. So we have a few interesting things to look at here, such as how wide should we be opening, how wide can the small blind pre-bet stack off, and should we continue against the pre-bet? Should we jam? Should we call? Should we fold? What should we do? The first thing I wanted to do here is run a limp check. So see, do we actually have any kind of limps here? I did this for the lower stack size that we will examine, but we don't have limps. So let's start with that. Then let's look at the actual GTO solution for these stack sizes here. Under the gun is supposed to raise about 17.6%. which is basically 6s plus, suited 9x, suited aces, and most good Broadways. Not a very wide raising range, but not too tight either. And that's because we have a starting bounty, which just isn't worth much. So the starting stack here is 25k, as we can see. Therefore, our bounty here is worth maybe 9k, which is about 3 big blinds. So we're raising out of 30, and our bounty is worth 3. So it's just not very significant. Therefore, we can raise fairly wide. Against this, the cutoff doesn't get to call that much. Basically, pocket pairs and good suited hands. And again, the reasoning behind that is that our bounty isn't worth much. If our bounty was larger, his calling range would also be wider. After the cutoff calls, the small blind gets to squeeze a range like this. So 9 plus, ace queen for value. And then as bluffs, we're using some king queen off, ace 10 off, kind of has like some ace 8 suited, ace 9 suited, queen 10 suited. The reason that we have ace 10 over ace jack and king jack simply has to do with blockers and what each player calls and folds. It's not something I would pay too much attention to because it's very spot specific. But basically, the main thing to keep in mind is that we go 9s plus, some 8s for value, ace queen, and then for bluffs we use high card blockers. Again, this 3-bet, the small blind actually gets, the under the gun player actually gets to go fairly wide against the small blind. You can see 8 plus jam, ace queen plus, and even some king jack suited, ace jack suited. We don't really have any calls, as we know in ICM situations we don't want to be calling 3-bets. But we do get to jam reasonably wide. The reason is that, as I said, we're not that close to money bubble, and also we still have a bunch of fold equity. The small blind is going to be folding like ace 10 off, king queen off, queen 10 off, these kind of hands as well. So the main takeaways from here would be that first we can open reasonably wide, even though we're close to the bubble, because our bounty is very small. And we get to stack off fairly wide as well, because the spot where we have some fold equity and our risk premium isn't extremely large, because it's a PSKO tournament. The next thing I want to look at is what if we actually had 20 big blinds? So if our stack was lower and we were covered by the entire table, and then also our bounty would be a bigger portion of our stack. Here we go. So first thing I did, as I said, I wanted to run a limp check again, see if we get to have limps. And the answer is no, not really. This sim would take literal days to run. So after seeing that we don't have limps, I remove the limping option and went with a raise only and run this for high accuracy. So we can see that when we have 20 big blinds, we get to raise slightly tighter. We raise 15.2 up from down from 17.6. So it is a fairly significant difference, but it's still not too tight. Against our raise, the cutoff would be calling a similar kind of range, and the small blind would be squeezing very linear now. Now, no more bluffs, just linear squeezing, because he can't really 3-bet fold against our stack size too much. The main reason here was to check how tight we get to open, and also if we have limps at this 20 big blind stack size. Both answered no limps, and we still get to open fairly wide. The final thing about this spot is how wide would we open if we had the covering stack? So if instead of having 30 big blinds, we had, say, 60 big blinds. So this would be 50 big blinds, not 60. Same thing, still covering everyone. So now we get to raise 24.5%. This increase happens because, of course, we cover and we are near the bubble, but also because their bounties, or some people's bounties, are relatively big, so they can't play back much. Basically, if we think about us having 50 big blinds here, the stacks that are somewhat big, like for example, under the gun 1 or the button or the small blind, also have bigger bounties. So they just can't really play back much. And if we look at this, for example, the small blind here just isn't 3-betting a lot, and neither is the button, and neither is under the gun 1. Under the gun 1 does have the wider 3-bet range of the 3, but it's not going to be very wide at all. So because of that, we just get to raise significantly more. We go up to 24.5%. We can see that we add a lot of suited hands to our range. We don't necessarily add many blocker kind of hands. If we look at this when we had the original 30 big blind stack size, in terms of offsuit, like blocker hands, we just add some like queen 10 off, jack 10 off, right? These are the only hands. We expand on the suited department a lot because we're very likely to go post flop. All the positions behind, besides maybe under the gun one and hijack, do have a significant calling range. This is the cutoff. This is the button. This is the small blind. So you can see that we are very, very likely to actually go post flop. So we want to have suited hands and hands that flop well. As for the stack sizes behind, the main positions that 3-bet will be the earliest one. So MP is the one that 3-bets the most, doesn't get to call much. And hijack, who has a 24 big blind stack, also just wants to 3-bet. A few facts worth pointing out is that even though the hijack has 24 big blinds, he just doesn't really have jams. The reason is that he's up against a very wide range and also has a lot of live ranges behind. So this is something that generally happens in ICM. We don't want to have jams for these kind of stack sizes. We just want to 3-bet fairly wide. So you can see even like ace queen off is a hand that 3-bets, doesn't call, doesn't jam. Definitely something to keep in mind. And the small blind, who is the stack that is very close to us, gets to call very wide against our open. If he was covering, he would call, of course, much wider, add a lot more suited connected stuff. As for the big blind, who would be the shortest stack or one of the shortest stacks, how wide does he get to defend? Well, fairly wide. You can see he gets to call 27% and raise about 8.5. So fairly wide, but nowhere close to a GPV situation, right? So risk premium is there and affects how wide he can call. Even though our under the gun range is going to be very wide here, 24.5, the big blind can only call 27%. Folding offsuit ace-x, folding offsuit king, queen x, hands like that. Basically, we want to be suited or just have strong connected hands. As a point of comparison, when we had 20 big blinds, so when we were covered by the big blind, this is what the big blind range looked like. So not that much wider. Even though he covers us in this scenario, where under the gun has 20 big blinds, the big blind still has to play fairly tight because the under the gun opening range is very tight itself. So because the big blind is up against a very strong range, he can defend very wide regardless of covering. The bound is also not super significant, as we said. Yes, we have 20 big blinds, but our bound is worth like 3. So, nothing extreme. And the last example I want to look at is this king-queen suited. So here we are 38 players left with 31 paid. So fairly close to the money bubble, but not exactly there yet. We are on the cutoff with 59 big blinds. So we cover small and big blind, but we are covered by the button barely. Our bound is pretty large. So the starting stack here is 50K and starting bound is 250. We have 5 starting bounties and the big blind is 6K. So it would be around maybe 9K, so 45K. So our bound is worth around 7 to 8 big blinds. So it's significant, but it's not, a super big portion of our stack. So king queen suited, very clear open for us, and we get 3-bet by the bottom. So the interesting question would be, what do we get to do here? And just also check out how wide we can open, how much the button should be 3-betting, and generally what's happening in this spot. We can be opening a fairly wide range because we cover 2 of the 3 stack sizes behind. We can see we're opening 34%. So yes, it's fairly wide, very close to a normal GPV kind of range. Against this open, the button gets to play like this. So gets to 3-bet us very aggressively in this spot and attack our wide opening range. We can see the button's 3-bet range isn't very polar either. We can see a lot of suited hands like 10-9, Jack-9, King-10, even suited connectors. The reason this happens is that we are relatively deep, so there's no need for him to go super polar. Also, the risk premiums aren't very, very high either. Cutoff against button is at 11.5%. So yes, it's there, but it's not that limiting. The button against the cutoff is at plus 1.8. So because our bounty isn't super huge, he still has some ICM pressure against us. Not much, but it's there. So yeah, we can see not too polar of a range. Of course, still has the offsuit ace-x as bluffs, but still also 3-betting a lot of suited connected hands. after the button 3 bets, we get to play like this, which I think is very interesting. So we don't get to have many calls. As we know, ICM and calling 3 bets is not a combination that goes well with each other. So we're calling strong pocket pairs and strong suited stuff. However, we get to 4-bet very, very aggressively. You can see suited aces, even Jack 10 suited, King 9 suited, Ace Jack off, and so on, are hands that want a 4-bet. Do we 4-bet to get it in? With some of those, obviously. So after we 4-bet, the button doesn't get to have any jams, which is also fairly interesting. He just wants to click it back a lot. And the reason behind that is that against a 4-bet range that looks like this, there are basically no hands that really benefit from jamming. I guess Ace King off would be the only one, which is also the one that sometimes ends up jamming. You want to either induce, and you can see that after King induces, we get to jam our pocket pairs and Ace Queen off. Or, you want to bluff with the suited kings and some aces off. So this is a very interesting dynamic and something that doesn't happen too much in other areas of the game. But yeah, basically against this kind of 4-bet range, we want to click it back because there's no calling. Like there's no hand that the cutoff we call. Now, if the button falls against the cutoff open here, small blind gets to mostly call. Calls very wide. The stacks are super close. So a lot of hands that can just call and play post-flop. And 3-betting mostly suited stuff. We can see very little offsuit stuff 3-betting. Also, hand like Jacks, Queens, not really interested in 3-betting here because the risk premium is fairly high. So small blind against cutoff, we can see 11.5%. If the small blind calls, the big blind has no jams and just 3-bets like this. So a very strong big range and then mostly offsuit blocker hands. Again, because the big blind squeezes a fairly large sizing, there is not going to be much calling, so just wants to focus more towards blockers and not like suited connected hands. So the next thing that I want to look at here is make one adjustment. So basically look at what would happen if this was a stone bubble. So instead of us being at 38 players left with 31 paid, we were at 32 players left with 31 paid. Let's have a look. Our opening range from the cutoff doesn't really change too much. We can see we're opening 35%, we were opening 34.2, so it's basically the same kind of range. What about the button's 3-betting range though? So he used to be 17, now it's 19. So yes, increases slightly, but it's not too significant. Against the 3-bet, our 4-bet range is a little bit differently constructed here. So we can see we want to call a bit more hands, and we want to 4-bet a bit more, blocker heavy. But the ranges end up looking very, very similar, even though now we're on the direct bubble. Against the 4-bet, again, the button, no jumps. As for the small blind after we open and the button folds, again, a very, very similar range construction. So we can see that even though we're a bit further away from the bubble in the original spot, when we go on the direct bubble, the ranges don't really change. And we can compare the risk premiums as well. So in the original spot, we said that the cutoff has 11.5 against the button, and the blinds have around 11.5 against cutoff and button themselves. In the stone bubble spot, we can see that now the risk premiums are around 13, 13.5. So yes, they have increased a bit, but it's very slight. And we still have a good takeaway that even if we're a bit further away from the bubble, things don't change compared to when we're on the stone bubble. It's very, very small differences and very slight risk premium adjustments. Okay, so now on this spot, let's change the stack size a bit again. So first, let's give us a 40 big blind stack size. So now we would be covered by everyone. Here we are. Now our opening range becomes much, much tighter. We would be opening 34%. Now we're opening 18%. So it's as if our opening range was cut in half. This just shows how important it is to be covering people, or at least being very close to them in stacks. Now that we have 40 big blinds, our bounty is worth a lot compared to our stack, so we just get to play fairly tight. Our risk premium against the other positions has decreased. We said it was around 11.5 against the bottom, now it is 10.9. So yes, our risk premium has decreased, but their risk premium against us is now negative, so they can play much wider ranges. After we open, the button gets to play like this. So now we can see a much more polar 3-betting range, but also generally just calling more. One thing to keep in mind is that our range is significantly tighter, so the button can go too crazy after us. For example, he can call like 6-4 suited or like 10-7 suited because we only open 18%. The small blind is 3-betting more, again, wider for value and more with bluffs. But we can also see that the calling range isn't too wide because of how tight our opening range is. In the original spot, the small blind was calling like suited 8s and suited connectors, and king 5, king 6 suited. Whereas now, these hands can't really call, like jack 8 suited, queen 8 suited, these low suited kings, just not profitable calls anymore. Even though they cover us, because we only open 18%, they have to play tighter. Then for this 40 big blind spot, I also ran it if we're on the direct bubble to see what changes. And we can see that now we open 14.7. So we go very tight, and our risk premium is at 14.4%. Against this range, again, the positions behind can't play too wide. You can see the button calling about 18%. Small blind, again, can't really call that much. He gets to call a bit more because we have to play more passive post-flop because of our risk premium, so he calls more than when we weren't on the direct bubble. And one parenthesis, this is something to always keep in mind, that when we are the covering stack and the other stack has to play tight post-flop, our equity realization goes up. So because the risk premium of the cutoff here is higher, he will have to play more passive post-flop and use smaller sizings, check back more, fold to check raises more, and so on. The small blind's equity realization goes up, so the small blind just gets to call more against the open. So we would open, as we said, around 18% when it was 38 pairs left with 31 paid, and we open 14% when it's on the stone bubble. Even though we have 40 big blinds, we have to be very tight. And then here, the final change I want to make is give us 70 big blinds. So now we have 70 and we cover everyone behind. Our opening range now goes to 47%. Originally, it was 34, so now it's 47, so it increases quite a bit when we cover the bottle. Also, the positions behind have to play a much more call-heavy range now, but they are covered. You can see the bottle 3-bets only 8.9%, whereas originally he was 3-betting at 19%. So very big difference. They get to call bottom gets to call fairly wide because our opening range is very wide as well. So we can see jack 10 off, suited hands. And same goes for the other positions. Small blind can call very wide, but not 3-bet much. Big blind, the same. And if this was the stone bubble and us having 70 big blinds, then our opening range would be 52%, not changing too much because since we're up against large stack sizes, they can still call a lot. You can see on the stone bubble, the button is calling 25%. Because our range is very wide, and he has 61 big blinds, so it's not likely that he gets to stack off post-flop. So it's a very cheap way to play back by calling. A very wide range against a very wide opening range. Small blind, the same. You can see calling queen 5 suited here, 7-5 suited. Big blind calls very wide as well. So one thing that we have here that is fairly significant is that we can see the button and the blinds actually get to call more against the big stack than against the short stack because of the difference in the opening range. The short stack, when we had 40 big blinds, we were opening like 18% or 14% on the stone bubble. Whereas here, on the stone bubble, we open 52%. So our range is super wide. So the positions behind can actually call very wide. We don't really want to be 3-betting because they don't want to risk busting, but they can call and go post-flop. And because they're up against a very wide range, their equity realization will be fairly good. But yeah, hopefully this sheds some light into how we should be playing PSKO bubbles and the main differences between a PSKO bubble and a regular bubble.